Look at the photograph. You've seen it 100 times. Maybe in a history book, maybe in a movie, maybe on a tourism poster with soft golden light and the words, "Experience the Old South." A grand white mansion, tall columns rising 2 stories high, a long avenue of oak trees leading up to the front door. It's a beautiful image. And that's exactly the problem. Because that photograph was designed, not just the house, the angle, the framing, what's in the shot, and more importantly, what isn't. Every time you look at a plantation house from the front, you are looking at it exactly the way its owner wanted you to. You are standing where guests stood, where creditors stood, where visiting politicians stood. All of them meant to see one thing and one thing only: power made comfortable, wealth made elegant, control made to look like grace. Now turn around. Walk past the columns. Go around the side of the house, past the formal garden, past the manicured lawn, past the horseshoe drive. Keep walking until you reach the back. And suddenly, the real plantation appears. A kitchen building, separate from the house, smoke already rising from its chimney before sunrise. A dairy, a smokehouse, a washhouse with huge iron kettles, fires already lit underneath them. A well in the center of a wide yard where a dozen people are already moving, already working, already invisible to anyone standing on that front porch. And further back, maybe 100 yards, maybe 2, a row of small cabins, one after another, facing the house like they've been told to watch it. 23 of them at Somerset Place in North Carolina. 23 one-room structures for the people whose labor was the only reason that front porch was ever quiet enough to enjoy. This is the back of house. And this is the video nobody makes about plantation architecture. Here's the fact that the tourism brochures never quite get around to printing. The plantation house was not a house, it was a campus, a fully operational production facility disguised as a home. Contemporary observers, people who actually visited these estates in the 1830s and 1840s, wrote that the outbuildings and yards behind a plantation house were so extensive that the compound, by itself, resembled a small town. Scholars today describe antebellum plantation layouts as having 4 distinct spatial zones: the manor house, the fields, the production centers, and the slaves' quarters. The mansion was just Zone 1. The rest of the system, the part that made Zone 1 function, stretched out behind it for hundreds of yards. Take Gunston Hall in Virginia, one main house, as many as 37 outbuildings clustered around it: workshops, storage sheds, kitchens, laundries, quarters, barns. A small town operating under a single owner's absolute authority. Or Somerset Place in North Carolina, where the documented site plan shows not one compound but 2, the owner's compound on one side, and directly across from it, labeled on the actual historic map, the enslaved community complex. 23 cabins in a row, 1 room each, facing the house. That map, once you've seen it, is very hard to unsee. The architecture of the antebellum Deep South, centered in Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, reached what historians call its golden age roughly between 1820 and 1860. Cotton capitalism was exploding. Rice and sugar plantations along the coast and the lower Mississippi were generating fortunes so large they distorted the entire regional economy. And the planters who controlled this wealth had a problem that money alone couldn't solve. How do you display that kind of power without making it look violent? How do you build a home that says civilization and refinement when the foundation of your entire operation is coerced human labor on an industrial scale? The answer, it turns out, was architecture. You built a grand house in the Greek Revival style, all symmetry and classical proportion, columns evoking ancient democracy, white paint gleaming in the southern sun. You placed it at the end of a long drive framed by oak trees so that every visitor's approach was theatrical, controlled, awe-inspiring. You put the formal rooms at the front where guests would see them, and then, very deliberately, you pushed everything that made those rooms possible to the back. The cooking, the washing, the smoking of meat, the hauling of water, the making of candles and soap and cloth. All of it moved into a separate zone, out of sightlines, behind hedges and fences and carefully positioned outbuildings. The architectural term for what these planters were doing is spatial hierarchy. The human term is hiding the evidence. Not completely hiding it, that would be impossible. The work had to happen close enough to the big house to be useful. Meals had to be carried hot from the kitchen to the dining room. Clean linen had to move from the wash house to the bedrooms. Fresh dairy had to reach the table before it spoiled. So the back of house was never truly hidden. It was managed, positioned, oriented so that its noise and smoke and heat and constant human activity would remain just out of frame, just around the corner from the image the owner wanted the world to see. The enslaved people who lived and worked in that back-of-house zone understood this better than anyone. They knew both worlds. They walked the formal halls through side doors and service passages, invisible by design. They saw the parlor and they saw the kitchen. They knew what the front looked like, and they knew what kept it running. In ex-slave narratives collected after the Civil War, formerly enslaved people described these plantations not as one grand house, but as places filled with buildings, a complex, layered world that the big house mythology had always erased. That complexity is what this series is about. Because if you only ever look at the front of the plantation house, at the columns and the lawn and the soft golden light, you are doing exactly what the architect intended. You are seeing the performance and missing the machine. The machine is where the real history lives. And it's been standing behind that house this whole time, waiting for someone to turn around and look. Before a single guest arrived at a plantation dinner, before the candles were lit in the dining room or the table was set with imported china, a fire had already been burning for 6 hours. Not in the house, behind it. In a separate brick building behind the main structure, an enslaved cook had been awake since before dawn. A hearth large enough to roast an entire animal. Cast iron pots at different heights, each time to a different course of a meal that would be carried across a yard, up a service passage, through a side door, and placed in front of people who had just woken up. The cook knew the timing down to the minute. She had to, because by the time that food reached the dining room table, it needed to look like it had appeared effortlessly, like the house had simply produced it, the way a magic trick produces a coin from thin air. That detached kitchen building wasn't just a practical choice, it was a philosophical one. The layout wasn't accidental. Every building placement was a decision, and those decisions followed a clear set of priorities. Priority 1. Keep the unpleasant realities of food production away from the formal house. A kitchen fire is a dangerous, smoky, loud, smelly operation. A wash house with boiling kettles of lye soap produces steam and fumes. A dairy needs to stay cool and dry. A smokehouse curing meat generates days of continuous smoke. None of this belonged anywhere near a parlor where a planter was trying to impress a business partner or a judge, so everything went to the back, close enough to be useful, far enough to be deniable. Priority 2. Place wet work buildings near the water source. This sounds obvious, but it shaped the entire spatial logic of the service yard. The well sat at the center. Around it clustered the buildings that needed constant water: the kitchen, the wash house, the dairy. A slight downward slope from the main house to the well meant gravity helped move wastewater away. Shade trees positioned around the yard reduced heat and created airflow corridors. The yard wasn't landscaped for beauty. It was engineered for labor throughput. Priority 3, and this is the one the tourism brochures never mention, maintain clear sightlines for surveillance. At a plantation called L'Ermitage, analyzed in detail by the National Park Service, researchers documented something striking. The slave dwellings weren't positioned based on the convenience of the people living in them. They were spaced and oriented based on the convenience of watching them. The overseer's house sat at a vantage point with an unobstructed view of the quarters and the workyard. Paths between buildings were wide enough that movement could be monitored. Fences and gates controlled which routes workers could use and when. The NPS report states it plainly. The layout was deliberately designed to prevent enslaved workers from gaining power or participating in insurrection. A building's floor plan was considered a security measure. The architecture wasn't just about keeping smoke out of the parlor, it was about keeping people in their assigned positions within a system of total control. Every doorway, every pathway, every gap between structures was part of a calculated answer to one question: how do we manage hundreds of people who do not want to be here? Thomas Jefferson understood this logic as well as anyone, and he took it further than most. At Poplar Forest, his private retreat in Virginia, he designed a formal Palladian wing extending from the main house, a long, elegant structure containing the kitchen, workroom, laundry, and smokehouse. From the front, it looked like an architectural flourish, a symmetrical frame that made the house look grander. Walk into it and you found industrial-scale labor operations built into the beauty of the design. The elegance wasn't separate from the control. It was the control. Jefferson had found a way to make the machine look like ornament. The materials tell a story too. The main house might be built from fine brick or carefully detailed frame construction. Expensive, permanent. A statement of generational ambition. The service buildings behind it followed a different logic. Kitchens and smokehouses got brick because fire and moisture demanded it. Dairies got stone or thick-walled frame construction to maintain cool temperatures. But the slave quarters, the housing for the people doing all of this work, got whatever was cheapest and fastest to build. In the early decades of the antebellum period, that meant log cabins, one room, one hearth, no insulation beyond the gaps you could fill with clay. By the 1830s and 1840s, some planters began upgrading quarters to wood frame or even brick construction, and they made sure visitors knew about it. Housing reforms got cited in letters and journals as evidence of good management, of Christian responsibility, of the plantation as a well-ordered household. What the letters don't say, what you have to read between the lines to find, is that the reforms were almost never about comfort. They were about durability. Brick lasts longer than logs. A better-built cabin is a better-maintained investment. The enslaved person inside the cabin was also an investment, legally and financially, and the building around them reflected that calculus with a coldness that is difficult to fully absorb even now. The structure improved. The labor regime did not. Move through the yard of a functioning antebellum plantation on any given morning, and what you'd encounter is organized chaos. Fires in 3 different buildings, water being hauled continuously from the central well, laundry boiling in iron kettles that required constant tending, butter being churned in the dairy before the heat of the day made it impossible, meat being hung in the smokehouse on a rotation that required precise timing, children being watched by older children so that adults could work, animals being tended, gardens being maintained, tools being repaired. All of this happening simultaneously, all of it feeding into a single end product, a household that appeared, to anyone looking at it from the front, to be running without effort. The word for this kind of architecture, where the real structural logic is hidden behind a composed exterior, is theatrical. The plantation house was a stage. The back of house was the rigging, the lighting board, the green room where the actual work of the performance was done. And like all good theater, it only worked if the audience never thought to look behind the curtain. Most people for a long time didn't. Pick up any hinge from a plantation door. Anyone. Run your finger along the edge where the metal was hammered flat, where the bolt holes were drilled, where the surface was finished smooth enough to fit flush against hardwood. Someone made that hinge. Someone heated the iron, shaped it, cooled it, tested it, fitted it. That person almost certainly had a name, a family, a set of skills developed over years of practice. And almost certainly, that person was enslaved. We don't know their name. The records weren't kept that way. What we do know, what archaeology, plantation inventories, construction records, and ex-slave narratives have established beyond any serious dispute, is that the antebellum plantation was not built for enslaved people while they watched. It was built by them, from the foundation up, while the men who owned it on paper took the credit and the profit and the historical memory. That's not a rhetorical point. That's a structural fact about how these places were constructed, and once you understand it, the plantation landscape looks completely different. Start with the raw materials, because the supply chain alone dismantles the myth that these estates were products of white entrepreneurial genius. Timber came from plantation forests. Enslaved laborers felled the trees, hauled them to saw pits or mills, and cut them into usable lumber. The sawyer, the man who ran the pit saw, whose job required precise judgment about grain and cut angle and board thickness, was typically enslaved. The lumber that framed the big house, the quarters, the kitchen building, the smokehouse, every outbuilding on the property, all of it processed by men whose wages were zero and whose workday ended when the overseer said it did. Brick came from plantation clay pits. Enslaved workers dug the clay, mixed it, packed it into molds, fired it in kilns that burned for days at temperatures that had to be carefully maintained, then sorted and stacked the finished brick. The brickmaker's craft, knowing the right clay composition, the right firing temperature, the right cooling time, was specialized knowledge, passed down and refined over years. Entire plantation complexes, including both the grand house and its service buildings, were built from brick that enslaved people made with their own hands from dirt they dug themselves. And then there was the iron. Every hinge, every latch, every nail driven into every board of every building on the property, made in plantation blacksmith shops by enslaved men whose skill could fabricate or repair almost any metal object the estate needed. When something broke, the blacksmith fixed it. When something new was needed, the blacksmith made it. Made by hand, by people who were legally considered property themselves. The construction process for a new building wasn't a matter of hiring a contractor and stepping back. It was a months-long, sometimes years-long campaign run almost entirely by enslaved labor, with white supervision that ranged from active to minimal depending on the owner's interest and the foreman's competence. Skilled enslaved carpenters would lay out the frame, cut the joinery, raise the walls. Enslaved masons would lay the foundation and, where brick construction was specified, build up the walls course by course. Enslaved plasterers finished interior walls. Enslaved painters applied the whitewash that made the finished buildings gleam in the southern sun, the same gleam that tourists now photograph and call timeless. What makes this especially significant is that enslaved craftsmen weren't simply executing someone else's designs, they were making decisions. When a planner's sketch was vague, and many were, the carpenter on site interpreted it. When materials ran short or a design detail proved impractical, the mason adapted. Scholars who study vernacular architecture argue that the actual built forms of plantation service buildings and quarters bear the imprint of the people who constructed them, not just the people who commissioned them. The builders left their mark in the only way available to them, in the structures themselves. The back of house, in other words, was not purely the physical expression of white planter vision. It was a negotiation, encoded in wood and brick, between what was demanded and what was built by people who had knowledge, judgment, and cultural memory of their own. Then the building was finished, and the real work began. Because construction was only one layer of the labor that made the plantation function, the daily operational labor, the work that had to happen every single day without pause, regardless of weather or illness or grief, fell almost entirely on enslaved women and girls working in the back-of-house zone. Consider what a single day in that kitchen actually demanded. The cook arrived before dawn. She managed a large open hearth with multiple cooking surfaces simultaneously, roasting, boiling, frying, baking, producing meals for the white family, for guests, sometimes for overseers. In summer, in a brick kitchen building in Georgia or Mississippi, the temperature near the hearth exceeded anything that would be considered survivable as a work environment today. She worked in it anyway. She had no choice. Then, the washing. Linens and clothes boiled in iron kettles of scalding water with lye soap, scrubbed on washboards until the skin cracked, wrung by hand until the arms burned, hung, collected, ironed with flat irons heated directly in the fire, each piece requiring its own cycle of effort before being folded and returned to rooms that would soil them again by nightfall. A plantation mistress wrote in her diary that the household laundry was always beautifully managed. She did not write who managed it. The records that do survive, plantation account books, overseer journals, mistress diaries, tend to note when things went wrong, when a cook was sick and the meal was late, when laundry wasn't finished on schedule, when a dairy cow produced less than expected. The labor itself, when it functioned correctly, was simply not recorded. It was too ordinary, too constant, too taken for granted to merit notation. Invisibility by documentation. The work disappeared into the assumption that it would always be done. Many enslaved people also worked what you might call a second shift. When the official workday ended and the yard finally fell quiet, enslaved people in their quarters worked again, for themselves. They tended small garden plots tucked around their cabins, growing food to supplement the inadequate rations the plantation allocated. They made furniture from scavenged materials. They repaired their own clothing. They produced small crafts, baskets, pottery, carved objects that could sometimes be traded or sold within the limited, informal economies that existed even under slavery. This wasn't leisure, it was survival strategy. And it was conducted in the same back-of-house spaces, the yards, the gardens around the quarters, the sheds and outbuildings, that daytime labor had claimed for the plantation's benefit. The same hands that built the hinge in the morning were weaving a basket by firelight at night. Same hands, different purpose. And in that difference, in that insistence on making something for themselves in the hours that weren't officially owned, is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the people who built this world. They were never just what the system required them to be. No, imagine you are deeply in debt. Not the ordinary kind, not a mortgage or a car payment, the kind of debt that follows you into every conversation, that sits behind every handshake, that makes every dinner party a quiet audition for continued credit worthiness. You owe money to merchants in Charleston, to cotton factors in New Orleans, to banks in Philadelphia whose clerks have never seen your land but have very firm opinions about what it should be producing. Your entire financial existence, your family's future, your children's inheritance, your own reputation in the only social world that matters to you, rests on a single question that gets asked in various forms every time someone of consequence visits your property. Is this man in control? Not just of his finances, not just of his crops, of everything, of the landscape, of the labor, of the appearance of order and competence and Christian propriety that the antebellum Southern planter class had decided was the visible proof of a man's fitness to hold power. The plantation house and its entire back-of-house system wasn't just where you lived, it was your argument, made in wood and brick and whitewash and the disciplined movement of dozens of human beings, that you deserved everything you had. This is the psychology that built the plantation, not comfort, not even wealth exactly, status anxiety dressed up as architecture. The planter elite of the Deep South between 1820 and 1860 was a surprisingly small group, exercising an outsized amount of political and economic power, and they knew it. The truly large slaveholders, those controlling the kind of elaborate plantation complexes we're discussing, represented a minority of the white Southern population, yet they controlled the majority of the region's productive land and dominated its political institutions completely. That concentration of power created its own pressure. To hold it, you had to perform it, constantly, visibly, for other members of the planter class, for poorer white neighbors who needed to see the hierarchy reinforced, for northern visitors whose opinions shaped the national conversation about slavery, and for the enslaved population itself, whose daily compliance could never be fully assumed and therefore had to be architecturally enforced. Every decision about the plantation landscape, where to put the kitchen, how far the quarters sat from the main house, whether to upgrade cabin construction from log to brick, how wide to make the central avenue of approach, was made inside this pressure. The aesthetic choices and the control choices were the same choices, made simultaneously for the same reasons. Take the question of the overseer's house. On a well-organized antebellum plantation, the overseer didn't live randomly. His house was positioned deliberately, carefully, at a point that gave him maximum visual access to the slave quarters and the workyard. This wasn't a coincidence of convenience, it was a design specification. The overseer needed to see and be seen seeing at all times. His physical presence in the landscape was itself a management tool, and the architecture was arranged to make that presence as effective as possible. And the owner who designed it would have described it, if you'd asked him, as good management, responsible stewardship, the Christian duty of a man entrusted with authority over a large household. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The same framework, Christian duty, responsible stewardship, the obligation of the powerful to manage the powerless wisely, that was used to justify slavery as an institution, was also used to justify every specific architectural choice that enforced it. The language of benevolence and the machinery of control were not in tension in the planter's mind. They were the same thing. Which brings us to the housing reform question. Because nothing reveals the owner psychology more clearly than what happened to slave quarters in the 1830s and 1840s. By that period, abolitionist pressure from the North had become loud enough that Southern planters were increasingly aware their labor system was being scrutinized and condemned by a growing audience. Some responded with violence and political entrenchment. Others responded with renovation. Crude log cabins got replaced with wood frame or brick structures. Quarters got whitewashed. Some plantations arranged their cabin rows with deliberate symmetry, neat fences, swept yards. Planters wrote about these improvements in letters and published agricultural journals, framing them as evidence of their genuine concern for the people they enslaved. Proof that the plantation was a Christian household, not a labor camp. The argument went, look at the quality of these buildings. Would a cruel man build such decent housing? The neat cabin is evidence of the good master. What the argument didn't mention, what the letters and journals consistently omit, is the actual reason most of these upgrades happened. Brick lasts longer than logs. A well-built cabin requires less maintenance over a decade than a poorly built one. The enslaved person inside the cabin was a financial asset valued in the thousands of dollars, and protecting that asset from the diseases and exposure that inadequate housing accelerated made straightforward economic sense. The reform was an investment decision presented as a moral one. The upgrade was real, the humanity behind it was largely performance. And the performance was carefully directed at a specific audience: Northern critics, visiting journalists, potential business partners, while the daily reality of what happened inside and around those improved cabins remained unchanged. Same workload, same surveillance, same punishment for noncompliance. Better walls, same system. There's one more layer to the owner psychology that rarely makes it into the official story, and it's perhaps the most revealing. Fear. Not the stated fears, not the economic anxieties or the reputational concerns, though those were real. The deeper, quieter fear that shaped every spatial decision on a plantation with dozens or hundreds of enslaved people, the fear of what happens if this stops working. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 sent a tremor through the entire planter class that never fully dissipated. The increasingly tight spatial controls and surveillance architectures of the years that followed reflect in part the fear that rebellion like Turner's could happen anywhere. Planters who had never much thought about the geometry of their yards began thinking about it with considerable urgency. The orderly plantation landscape, with its controlled paths and supervised quarters and carefully managed sightlines, was not only a display of power, it was a defense against the possibility that power might be challenged. The beauty of the arrangement masked the anxiety driving it, and that anxiety was, at its core, an acknowledgement of something the public ideology of Southern slavery could never quite admit: that the people being controlled were people, with their own assessments of the situation, their own calculations about what was possible and what wasn't, their own patience, which was not infinite. The architecture was so elaborate, so deliberate, so relentlessly focused on surveillance and control precisely because the owners understood, in the part of themselves that the letters and journals didn't record, that what they had built was not stable, that it required constant maintenance not just of buildings, but of a fiction. And fictions, no matter how well constructed, eventually end. Every plantation had two sunrises. The first one belonged to the back of house. Long before the main house stirred, before anyone in the formal bedrooms had opened their eyes, the yard behind it was already alive. Fires lit in the kitchen building, water hauled from the central well in the gray pre-dawn dark. Cast iron pots positioned over heat that had been carefully rebuilt from the previous night's coals. The dairy checked, the animals fed, the wash-house kettle filled and set to boil. An entire operational day launched in silence and darkness by people whose names the plantation records rarely bothered to preserve. The second sunrise, the official one, the one that counted, happened when the White family woke up. By that point, breakfast was already cooked, hot water was already available. The household was already running at full capacity. The transition from night to day had already been managed, absorbed, and made invisible by the labor of people who had been awake for 2 hours before the sun came up. What the family experienced as the gentle beginning of a morning was, for the people in the back of house, already the middle of a working day. This is what the quarters were for: not just sleeping, not just housing. The quarters were the operational base of the entire back-of-house system, the place where the people who ran the plantation's domestic machinery lived, rested in whatever hours remained, and somehow, against considerable odds, built lives. Picture the quarters as they actually existed, not as they appear in the sanitized versions, not the neat whitewashed cabins in the tourism photographs, but the structures as ex-slave narratives and archaeological digs describe them. One room, typically, sometimes two if a family was large or if the owner had made recent upgrades for appearances. A central hearth that served simultaneously as the cooking fire, the heating source, and the only light after dark. Walls that in the earlier period were often rough-hewn logs with gaps that let in winter wind, stuffed with clay or rags that needed constant maintenance. A dirt floor in many cases. Minimal furniture. Whatever could be built from scavenged materials, whatever had been passed down, whatever could be made in the hours that weren't owned by the plantation. A family of 5 or 6 people in that space, sometimes more. Privacy was not a concept the architecture accommodated. Every conversation, every moment of grief or tenderness or fear happened within hearing of everyone else in the room, and within hearing often of the next cabin over where another family lived the same compressed existence. Set 1 to 200 yards from the main house, close enough to be summoned quickly, far enough to keep the noise and nighttime life at a manageable distance. That distance was not chosen for the comfort of the people in the cabins. It was chosen for the comfort of the people in the house. And yet, here is what the plantation's architects had failed to calculate. In those cabins, in that compressed, difficult space, something was built that no floor plan had designed for and no overseer could fully suppress: community. After the overseer's oversight lifted for the day, after the formal labor had ended and darkness gave some cover, the quarters became a different kind of place. Music happened there. Not the sanitized versions that white visitors sometimes described in their journals, curious, amused, slightly condescending, but music as a genuine cultural practice, carrying traditions, encoding memory, expressing things that could not be said in the yard during working hours. Storytelling happened. The oral tradition that preserved history, ethics, humor, and survival knowledge across generations operated in those cabin rooms at night, passing from the people who remembered an earlier life to the children who had never known anything but the plantation. Religion happened, not always in the sanctioned Sunday morning format, but in its own forms, in its own language, serving its own purposes. Worship as resistance, prayer as insistence that the people praying had a moral existence that the law's definition of them as property could not actually reach. The testimonies collected after the Civil War return again and again to these nighttime quarters as sites of genuine life, not comfortable life, not free life, but life with its own texture, its own humor, its own relationships, its own insistence on existing beyond the boundaries the plantation tried to impose. The gardens are where this insistence became most visible and most practical. Around many slave cabins, in the ETI's small patches of ground between structures or along the back edges of the quarters, enslaved people grew food, vegetables, herbs, occasionally small fruit trees. This was sometimes officially tolerated, a small garden plot acknowledged in plantation records as a concession that cost the owner little and reduced the pressure to provide adequate rations. But what happened in those gardens exceeded the tolerance. Enslaved people traded garden produce within the plantation and sometimes with neighboring farms. They built small informal economies. They accumulated slowly and with great difficulty small surpluses, not money in most cases, but goods, relationships, claims on reciprocity. Some kept chickens, some made crafts, baskets, pottery, carved objects that circulated through these informal networks. The garden and the craft work were economic acts conducted in the spaces the plantation had not quite figured out how to fully control. Scholars describe these acts carefully because it's easy to either romanticize them or dismiss them. They were not freedom, They did not constitute a hidden prosperity or a comfortable parallel existence. They happened in stolen hours, under constant risk, with the ever-present knowledge that everything could be taken away, including the people doing it, sold to another plantation without warning or recourse. But they mattered. They were not nothing. In a system designed to reduce human beings to their economic function, the garden and the basket and the song at night were insistences on a fuller humanity. Small ones, costly ones, real ones. The health reality of the quarters was brutal. Overcrowding meant that respiratory illness spread rapidly through cabin rows. One sick child in one room meant illness moving through an entire quarter within days. Poor sanitation, inadequate food allocation, and the physical demands of labor that began before dawn and ended after dark meant that chronic illness was ordinary life in the quarters, not the exception. Kitchen workers carried a specific set of risks. Burns from open hearth cooking were common. The chronic effects of smoke inhalation compounded over years. Heat exhaustion during summer months in brick kitchen buildings where temperatures near the fire were extreme. Laundry workers handled boiling water and caustic lye soap daily. Blacksmiths and carpenters worked with dangerous tools and materials. The back of house was not just exhausting, it was physically destructive in ways that accumulated over a lifetime. Against all of this, the overcrowding, the illness, the surveillance, the grief of families separated by sale, the daily weight of a system designed to extract maximum labor while acknowledging minimum humanity. The people in the quarters got up every morning before the sun and made the plantation run. Not because they had accepted the terms, because they had not been given a choice. And somewhere in the difference between those two things, between coerced compliance and genuine acceptance, they kept something the plantation could never quite reach, a private knowledge that the land they worked, the buildings they built, the food they grew and cooked and served belonged to them in a way that no deed of ownership could capture or any bill of sale could transfer. They said so, in the narratives, plainly, without apology. This is ours. We built it. We cleared it. We made it what it is. The columns on the front of the house said otherwise, but the people in the quarters knew what the columns didn't. Empires don't collapse cleanly, they fray. Here is what the history books almost always skip. The plantation didn't end in 1865, only the law did. The antebellum plantation system didn't end on a single day, though the legal paperwork suggests otherwise. What ended was the law. What remained, the land, the buildings, the spatial logic of big house and quarters and service yard, stayed exactly where it was. And the people who had built it, worked it, and kept it running for generations found themselves technically free still. Living in the same cabins, still looking at the same house from the same distance, still doing versions of the same work under new contractual arrangements that differed from slavery in legal definition far more than in daily reality. Picture the morning after Emancipation. A man stands in the doorway of a cabin he built with his own hands. He is legally free. The house at the end of the yard is still the house at the end of the yard. The fields are still the same fields. He has nowhere else to go, not because he lacks courage, because the promise of land redistribution, the 40 acres that would have begun to translate freedom into material reality, was revoked almost immediately after Lincoln's assassination. Without land, without capital, without legal protections that were reliably enforced, many freed people made the only practical choice available. They stayed. On land they had cleared and farmed for generations, in cabins they had built with their own hands, under terms they had not chosen. The plantation had lost its enslaved workforce and gained a tenant one. The commissary, often a converted outbuilding from the old service yard, became the mechanism of a new kind of control. Credit extended at rates that ensured perpetual indebtedness, binding workers to land they didn't own through economics rather than law. Different architecture, same geometry. What happened next, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is where the historical erasure becomes deliberate rather than incidental. As the plantation economy declined, as mechanization reduced the need for dense labor forces, as properties changed hands and purposes shifted, the physical complexes began to deteriorate selectively. And the selectivity is the point. The big houses got saved, not always immediately, not always completely, but with a consistency that amounts to a cultural pattern. Preservation societies formed around mansions. Wealthy families bought and restored columned facades. State historical commissions designated grand houses as landmarks worthy of protection, funding, and interpretation. The outbuildings didn't fare as well. Kitchens, dairies, smokehouses, washhouses, the functional architecture of the back of house were allowed to deteriorate, demolished for convenience, or simply never recorded before they disappeared. And the slave quarters, the cabins where the majority of the plantation's human population had actually lived, those vanished at a rate that can only be described as systematic. Not always intentionally systematic, but systematic in effect, driven by the consistent prioritization of the mansion over everything behind it. By the mid-20th century, when plantation tourism began to develop as a serious industry, the landscape had already been curated. Visitors arrived at houses that looked like the front of house image, columns, gardens, formal rooms, because that was what remained. The back had been erased, and the erasure had been going on long enough that it no longer looked like erasure, it just looked like history. The story told to the public shifted accordingly. Moonlight and magnolias. Southern gentility. The gracious hospitality of a lost civilization. These were not fringe narratives pushed by cranks. They were the dominant public interpretation of plantation history for most of the 20th century, reproduced in tourism materials, historical novels, film, and the interpretive programs of sites that received public funding and academic credibility. The people who had built the plantation, worked it, and sustained it across generations appeared in this narrative as background figures at best. The back of house where their lives had actually been lived was not part of the tour. It was not part of the story. It had been physically removed from the landscape and then narratively removed from the history. And the two removals reinforced each other so completely that most visitors never noticed anything was missing. A mansion standing alone in a field looks like history. What it actually is an absence. Everything that once surrounded it, gone. Time equals 1.0 seconds / greater than somewhere in Louisiana right now, a couple is booking a plantation wedding. They've chosen the venue for the oak alley, the white columns, the golden afternoon light that photographs beautifully. The website describes the property as offering timeless Southern elegance and an atmosphere of gracious history. The package includes access to the formal gardens, the grand ballroom, the wraparound veranda. There is, somewhere on the site, a brief mention of the estate's history, a single paragraph, carefully worded, acknowledging that enslaved people once lived and worked here. The slave cabins, if they still exist, are not part of the package. This is not an edge case. This is the default. Across the Deep South, hundreds of former plantation properties operate as event venues, bed and breakfasts, and tourist attractions where the primary product being sold is the aesthetic of the antebellum big house, the columns, the gardens, the fantasy of gracious, effortless living, stripped of the back-of-house reality that made it possible. The erasure that began with the physical demolition of outbuildings and quarters in the late 19th century continues today in marketing language, tour routes, and venue photography that frames out anything inconvenient. But something has been shifting. At Somerset Place in North Carolina, the site map now clearly labels two distinct zones: the owner's compound and the enslaved community complex. Visitors who come expecting a mansion tour find themselves confronted from the very first interpretive panel with the full spatial reality of what a plantation actually was. The cabins are there, the quarters are documented, the names of enslaved people, recovered painstakingly from records that were never designed to preserve them, appear on interpretive signs next to the structures where those people lived. At some sites, tours now begin in the quarters, not in the parlor, not on the front porch, in the back where the real history started every morning before dawn. The route moves toward the big house rather than away from it, reversing the traditional approach and, in doing so, reversing the traditional hierarchy of what counts as important. Descendant communities, people whose grandparents and great-grandparents lived in those cabins, are increasingly part of these interpretive conversations. One woman, whose great-great-grandmother is named in Somerset's records, stood at the door of cabin 21 on a Tuesday afternoon and told the tour group what her family had passed down about that cabin for 4 generations. No preservation society had ever recorded it. No academic had ever thought to ask. She just knew, because that is what families do. They remember. None of this is finished. The debates are live and they are uncomfortable. Whether plantation venues should host weddings at all, how bluntly the violence should be named, who controls the narrative and who funds the archaeology, and whose version of events gets the interpretive sign and whose gets the footnote. These are not settled questions. But the direction of the argument has changed. The back of house, the kitchen, the quarters, the wash house, the smokehouse, the central yard where dozens of people moved before the main house woke up, is no longer automatically treated as the part of the story that doesn't matter. Which means finally, we are beginning to look at the whole plantation, not just the part that was designed to be seen. Turn around. Face away from the columns. The real history has been standing behind the house this entire time.